Well, greetings, everybody, in Christian faith and the natural sciences. Early Friday morning in San Bruno, California, and up and ready soon enough. And having looked again at our reading for today, I thought, well, I actually do have some things I want to say. And basically, in response to Todd Charles Wood's chapter, because with Darrel's, I would say I mostly agree with him, as you kind of know anyway. But I thought I'd start. Chapter 7 is entitled "Genesis is History" by Wood, and right off in the first paragraph, so this is page 105, he talks about the strategy of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, in which people thought it would be great to do science. We might say they thought it was necessary in order for it to be science, but to do science without consulting Scripture. They also thought it was a good idea to do it without consulting the Quran or the sayings of the Buddha or the Book of Mormon or any other text. So they weren't picking on the Bible like exclusively. It had more to do with putting those kinds of sources to the side and trying their best to actually simply observe. I don't think we ever simply observe the world around us, but reason and evidence, he continues now to say, reason and evidence were supposed to be able to establish, well, the Christian faith all by themselves. Actually, while there certainly were, I suppose, some philosophers that thought you could establish the Christian faith simply on the basis of reason and looking at the evidence around you. In other words, what we call natural theology. I don't recall whether we've used that phrase in the class or not, but natural theology is a branch of theology in which those who are engaged in it are attempting to sort of answer the question, what can we know or think or believe to be the case about what we call God or Supreme Being if we're not consulting writings or religious traditions, but trying to restrict ourselves to observing our own existence within the larger frame of all that we see as existence. Yeah, so some did try to do that. That's a pretty rare effort and generally not thought in theology to be a very productive path, but there are people that do natural theology. But that's a different thing from what scientists were about. So that sentence by itself is problematic. Reason and evidence were supposed to be able to establish the Christian faith all by themselves. I guess, then he says in the next sentence, well, I don't guess, I can read it, but today we call this methodological naturalism, this exclusion of God from science. Now, actually, again, in the previous sentence, he's describing people excluding appeals to Scripture of any kind when doing theology. And again, I'm going to say there is such an effort, and we do call it natural theology, but that's never been thought of as science. So then he moves to the phrase methodological naturalism, which is an appropriate, in my opinion, phrase, concept applying to the natural sciences. So naturalism by itself, isms are always a belief or an ideology, and naturalism is the belief or idea that there is nothing but nature. In other words, if I'm a naturalist, philosophically speaking, I'm somebody that is an atheist. At best, I'd be an agnostic, but basically the idea would be I'd be saying there isn't anything. So I wouldn't call it creation because, as we said at the beginning of the class, the semester, the use of the word creation inevitably necessitates a creator. But naturalism, by definition, would be no creation, only nature, and then it would be left up to the observer or observers to kind of decide, well, what is the nature of that nature? But the commitment would be there's nothing but, we'll say, the natural world, nothing but the universe, however mysterious it might be. If I'm a naturalist, I run with the assumption that that's all there is. Now, there's an important adjective in front of that, methodological. So you have the word method in there. And basically there, the idea is not a philosophical naturalism where I'm committed to the idea that there is nothing but nature and therefore no power or mind beyond nature that we might call God. But if you're not talking about a sort of philosophical assumption or commitment, but rather a methodological naturalism, it means, okay, in my attempt to know the world around me, the method I'm going to employ is like a naturalist. I won't be going to some sacred book, whether it's the Bible or the Hindu stories of creation or anything else like that. I'm going to set those aside. I might believe in one of those texts or one of those traditions. I might be a practicing Hindu who's doing physics, but I'm going to assume for the sake of doing physics that Krishna is not actively involved in what I'm observing. Now, I might believe that Krishna is absolutely involved. See, so notice the same sort of things that we might say from the Christian's point of view could also be said from other religious standpoints as well. But, like in science, I want to say by definition. Now, one of the things that Todd Wood is doing is pushing back on that sort of definition, that science must be proceed from methodological naturalism. But the kind of the problem is, so whether I'm consulting Genesis or I'm a Hindu looking at some ancient cosmological story, we'll say of Shiva, or believe that there is one ultimate reality called Brahman, and so that everything I'm observing is in some way directly observing Brahman, but I'm not going to put it in my science paper because not everybody shares that kind of assumption or commitment. In fact, few do, right? So methodological naturalism simply says my method will be to set aside whatever my philosophical or religious presuppositions and commitments may be, and try to work with this scientific community around the world in observation, experimentation, yielding results that, granted, must be interpreted. There's nothing purely objective about this, but then can also be tested by other people. So that's a little bit about methodological naturalism. Now we go to the next page, and so he says in the big full paragraph on 106, so he's pushing back against this, right? So the idea of doing science as if God did not reveal himself in the Bible is incomprehensible to me. I'm going to assume then that for Todd Wood, I've never thought about it quite this way before, but it's the case. A Muslim scientist could write basically this same sentence. So the idea of doing science as if God did not reveal himself in the Quran is incomprehensible to me. So I'm going to do my science as the Quran gives me information about the world, Or if a Hindu were to write, so the idea of doing science as if Brahma did not reveal himself in the Hindu scriptures is absolutely incomprehensible to me. So I'm going to do my science. I'm still going to call it science while I'm reading ancient cosmological stories from the Hindu tradition to give me information about the world. So he goes on, even more, if you try to do this, if you try to do science as if God did not reveal himself in the Bible, you're going to go really wrong. Darrel looks at science today and sees such a powerful model of evolution that explains the history of life on this planet. I think that Darrel would say, well, it explains it to a significant degree. It doesn't explain it fully. Science can never actually explain anything fully because science can't really actually explain the mystery of existence itself, like why there is a world here for us to study and examine. It's possible to say, well, it just is, and that's all there is to it, and that's just what we call a brute fact, and you either accept the brute fact and proceed or not. But the moment you begin to ask, like, why does it exist? And there are attempts, like, I think in quantum physics and so on, to give like an explanation for why anything exists. I think that's never going to quite succeed. But back to Wood. He does not see this as being, I read that. I look at modern science as Wood, and I see discord and confusion. Really? I see discord and confusion. He'd have to explain what discord and confusion he sees, because he doesn't, excuse me, tell us here. Confusion created by a process that never intended to consider God in the first place. Again, no, that's correct. I'll say right or wrong, but I think it's right that the natural sciences operate with a methodological naturalism. So you're right, they don't consider God in the first place when they're doing science. Sounds crazy, but science needs to be redone. It's almost like he knew I was going to say that. I don't doubt we'll keep a lot of science. I wouldn't be surprised if we discover mistaken interpretations of Genesis along the way. But we can't make those decisions by doing science in isolation from Scripture. And again, here's the challenge he's going to run aground on. This would mean that scientists from all sorts of different religious traditions would do science alongside their Scripture and then write papers about that and expect other scientists like to go, oh, yeah, okay. I guess Muslim science is doing something different from us, so we'll all just do our different sciences. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose of what the scientific method of naturalism, methodological naturalism, is supposed to accomplish. So he ends there by saying Jesus must be Lord of all. Okay, well, just remember, you'll have other Hindu scientists saying Krishna must be Lord of all, and everything is going to revolve around what we know about the world because of the stories and the teachings of Lord Krishna. Or a Buddhist scientist can say, hey, all of my science is going to be strictly grounded in the teachings of the Buddha, and because Buddha is the ultimate wisdom. I've never even thought, before I turned on this machine this morning, about that sort of counter approach. I think it's important. I think it's important for somebody like Todd Wood to consider.